Hello and welcome to a special edition of My Sounds of Christmas. It's been a real feature of the last few months on Sunday evenings and then on YouTube that we've been able to interview a number of different people about the sounds that have shaped their lives. And we've had some great contributions and people have been so open about themselves and their own lives. Well, as a one-off at Christmas time, I've decided that I'll just open a window into my Christmas, particularly my Christmas as a child and as an adolescent. So I hope you enjoy it. Christmas is, it's a cliche, but it is the most wonderful time of the year. It's a time for remembering, memory. It's a time for looking forward. It's a time for reconnecting with stories. I mean, that's at the heart of what we do at church at Christmas time. Particularly, obviously, we look at the birth stories as recorded in Matthew's Gospel and then in Luke's Gospel. And they're bewildering stories. They're strange stories. I mean, we're used to them, but they are both perplexing and beautiful at the same time. They're mysterious. There are angels everywhere. There's God's intervention shown in these particular narratives. You really don't see this intensely, I don't think, in any other part of the Bible. Leaves you scratching your head. And of course, at the heart of it all is this babe born in Bethlehem, the Son of God made flesh. Wonderful stories. But Christmas isn't simply about that story. It's about all kinds of other stories. And some of those I'll be sharing with you are the ones that have really had an impact on my life. But also it's about the stories of our lives. It's very hard not to be slightly nostalgic at this time of the year, to remember, to look back, and to think about our own childhood, our own experiences of Christmas. So that's what I'm going to do over the next few minutes, and intersperse my memories with some speech and some music. I was born in 1960. I know, hard to believe, isn't it, by looking at my youthful demeanour. But I was born in 1960 in Griffithstown, which is a village outside Pontypool in the Panteg Hospital, or the county hospital as it now is. And my parents and family were living in Risca. My dad was a minister then, Moriah Baptist Chapel in Risca, and that's where I was born. That's the home to which I was born. My parents were John and Mair, and I had 4 siblings, Elizabeth, Helen, David, Ewan, and then I was the 5th, the addition. The quartet became the quintet when I was born. And John and Mair were Welsh speakers, both of them. They both came from Welsh-speaking homes and Welsh-speaking areas. My mum came from Pontycymer in the Garw Valley, and my father came from Loughor and Gorseinon, just to the west of Swansea. And they insisted on speaking Welsh to us as children. Welsh was the language of the home. I never spoke to my parents in any other language other than Welsh, except when there were people who didn't speak Welsh around the place. And yet, strangely enough, they spoke English with each other. And that was a curious thing about our home, is that their own language as husband and wife was English, but with us as a family, it was Welsh. And of course, my earliest memories of Christmas as a child were kind of saturated with Welsh carols and Welsh chapel, if you like. Now, things have changed a great deal in the last few decades. Christmas has become much more of a celebration in some ways, or much more of a visual celebration. I don't remember seeing any candles growing up in any of my dad's churches. It was quite plain, I suppose you could say. In some ways, there were carols and Christmas trees, but there wasn't an awful lot given to tantalize the eye or the nose, for that matter. In recent years, of course, and I guess partly to do with the ecumenical movement and the charismatic movement. There's a far more awareness of the visual and the sacramental and the sense of the imagination being bound up in this mysterious event. But one carol which stands out for me, and that's the first one we're going to listen to today, is O Dewch Ffyddloniaid Oll gan Orfeleddi. It's the Welsh version of O Come All Ye Faithful, Joyful and Triumphant. It's my favourite carol of all of them. I think it's the king of carols. It's full of very strong doctrine from the early church. God of God, light of lights, true God, very God of very God. Words lifted from the Nicene Creed. And we're going to listen to O Dewch Ffyddloniaid. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you sang along to that lovely tune and maybe not so familiar words, although I'm sure many looking at this would know those words as well. Well, Christmas wouldn't be Christmas for me without stories, and one story in particular. It's the story of Ebenezer Scrooge and A Christmas Carol. I've made it a point in recent years to read the book. Well, it's not even a book really, it's a short story written by Charles Dickens. I read the book, read the story, or watch it. It's been made into so many different films as A Christmas Carol. This Christmas I even listened to it as an audible book, an audio book. So many different ways you can encounter this. And Christmas wouldn't be Christmas for me without A Christmas Carol. And there are so many layers and dimensions to this story, I think, for me. One, of course, is the whole notion of Christmas. I mean, Charles Dickens, I think, prided himself on having invented certainly the Victorian Christmas and our own sense of Christmas. I mean, That was his own boast, really, and certainly his later biographers have all made that point, that when he wrote A Christmas Carol, he wasn't just writing a Christmas story. He was kind of writing an account, a report of how Christmas should be celebrated. And so there are so many references to Christmas meals in A Christmas Carol, carol singing, giving to almsgiving, the sense of London, of a city at Christmas time, and of course, that supernatural element in this story. And at the heart of it all, and this is what is so powerful about A Christmas Carol, the heart of it all is this miser, Ebenezer Scrooge. And Ebenezer Scrooge, in the course of one night, encounters three ghosts or spirits, as Charles Dickens refers to them, of Christmas past, of Christmas present, and of Christmas future. And in the course of a deeply uncomfortable and disturbed night, Ebenezer Scrooge encounters a transformation. If you like, it's a kind of repentance. That's the word that Christians would use. A turning point in his life. He sees the man that he's been and is offered the chance to be a different kind of man. And that's what this story is all about. And so I'm going to play a clip to you now from Charles Dickens, A Christmas Carol. And it's towards the beginning of the story. It's where Scrooge has left his office on that Christmas Eve on his own. He has upbraided Bob Cratchit and has told him to come in early on Boxing Day. He's rather reluctantly given him a day off on Christmas Day. He's turned away people from his door. And here the lonely Ebenezer Scrooge returns to his home.
Father Christmas, Father Christmas, he's the meanest man in the old wide world. In the old wide world, you can feel it.
He's a miser. He's a skinflint.
He's a stingy lout, leave your stocking out for your Christmas gift, and he'll steal it. It's a shame, he's a villain. What a game for a villain to play on Christmas Day. Hark the aeroplane you'll see.
Thank you, Governor.
Father Christmas will be just as mean as he's ever been, and I'm here to say we should all send Father Christmas on his Merry Christmas way. Come on. Father Christmas! Father Christmas! He's the rockin'est man in the universe. There's no one worse who can tell it.
He's a rascal. He's a bandit.
Come on up there. Yeah.
He's a crafty one. Leave your door undone and go in your house and sell it.
Here's your money, sir. Pray count it.
You waste breath, sir. No one has ever changed me.
Kids are crying.
It's a scandal. What's a game for a vandal to play on Christmas Day?
Merry Christmas, sir. Merry Christmas.
Lavender, sweet lavender. Sweet lavender.
Hot broth, Mr. Scrooge. A small token of Christmas esteem with the compliments of Tom Jenkins.
No.
And there'll be a free can of broth, sir, every night for the coming year in gratitude for your infinite kindness in giving me another 2 weeks to pay.
1 week.
10 days?
1 week.
1 week.
And put a lid on that stuff. I'll take it home.
If you distrust Father Christmas, it's as well to know that I told you so, because I'm here to say we should all send Father Christmas.
Yes.
Father Christmas,
Father Christmas,
Father Christmas, Father Christmas.
on his Merry Christmas while.
Scrooge. Riley?
Handbag.
I could have chosen any number of clips from that film, but I chose that one because I think when I first saw that film with my sister, my older sister Elizabeth, we saw it in the Capitol Cinema in Cardiff. And I can't remember when we saw it. It must have been the early 70s. A long time ago. That cinema, that particular cinema, is no longer there. The Capitol is huge. It was seated thousands, did the Capitol. And I can remember going to see it with her and just being mesmerized by the story, but also what happens to that knocker on Ebenezer Scrooge's door when the face of Marley is seen. And that's the kind of harbinger of things to come that night for Ebenezer Scrooge. So my dad, as I mentioned earlier, grew up on the outskirts of Swansea, in a little place called Gorseinon, even though he was actually born in Lacha Common. And they weren't days of wealth for anybody. And my grandparents really had to manage, scrimp and save with very little, with a large family. And but they created a very loving home for them all, for my dad and for his siblings. They moved eventually from Lacha Common to Gorseinon, to a council house in Gorseinon. And my father said it was like moving to a palace, because for the first time in his little life, there was an indoor bathroom, and there was hot and cold water, an indoor toilet, things that were unimaginable for people, for many people in those days. But of course, that part of Wales, Swansea, is known for our poet laureate. If we had a poet laureate in Wales, it would always be Dylan Thomas. He'd get it every year. Prolific writer both in prose and in poetry. And Dylan Thomas wrote a very wonderful, well, it is a poem, but it's a short story, really. It's a kind of prose poem. I'm not sure what the genre would be, called A Child's Christmas in Wales. When I was in my teens, I remember having to learn this and present it, deliver it, at a school concert in Rhydfelyn, where I went to school, a Welsh secondary school. But it's always been a favourite. It's evocative, it's funny, it's full of that nostalgia of Christmases from long ago. And the way A Child's Christmas in Wales begins is very funny indeed, with a particular story, a particular memory of something that happens on Christmas Day. And so, let's go to it. It's A Child's Christmas in Wales, read by Dylan Thomas.
One Christmas was so much like the other in those years around the Seatown corner now, out of all sound except the distant speaking of the voices I sometimes hear a moment before sleep, that I can never remember whether it snowed for 6 days and 6 nights when I was 12, or whether it snowed for 12 days and 12 nights when I was 6. All the Christmases rolled down towards the two-tongued sea, like a cold and headlong moon bundling down the sky that was our street. And they stop at the rim of the ice-edged, fish-freezing waves, and I plunge my hands in the snow and bring out whatever I can find. In goes my hand into that wool-white, bell-tongued ball of holidays resting at the rim of the carol-singing sea, and out come Mrs. Prothero and the firemen. It was on the afternoon of the day of Christmas Eve, and I was in Mrs. Prothero's garden waiting for cats with her son Jim. It was snowing. It was always snowing at Christmas. December, in my memory, as white as Lapland, although there were no reindeers. But there were cats, patient, cold, and callous, our hands wrapped in socks. We waited to snowball the cats. Sleek and long as jaguars and horrible whiskered, spitting and snarling, they would slide and sidle over the white back garden walls, and the lynx-eyed hunters, Jim and I, fur-capped and moccasined trappers from Hudson Bay off Mumbles Road, would hurl our deadly snowballs at the green of their eyes. The wise cats never appeared. We were so still, Eskimo-footed Arctic marksmen in the muffling silence of the eternal snows, eternal ever since Wednesday, that we never heard Mrs. Prothero's first cry from her igloo at the bottom of the garden, or if we heard it at all, it was to us like the far-off challenge of our enemy and prey, the neighbor's polar cat. But soon the voice grew louder. "Fire!" cried Mrs. Prothero, and she beat the dinner gong. And we ran down the garden with the snowballs in our arms towards the house, and smoke indeed was pouring out of the dining room, and the gong was bombulating, and Mrs. Prothero was announcing ruin like a town crier in Pompeii. This was better than all the cats in Wales standing on the wall in a row. We bounded into the house laden with snowballs and stopped at the open door of the smoke-filled room. Something was burning, all right. Perhaps it was Mr. Prothero, who always slept there after midday dinner with a newspaper over his face. But he was standing in the middle of the room saying, "A fine Christmas," and smacking at the smoke with a slipper. "Call the fire brigade," cried Mrs. Prothero as she beat the gong. "They won't be here," said Mr. Prothero. "It's Christmas." There was no fire to be seen, only clouds of smoke, and Mr. Prothero standing in the middle of them, waving his slipper as though he were conducting. "Do something," he said, and we threw all our snowballs into the smoke. I think we missed Mr. Prothero and ran out of the house to the telephone box. "Let's call the police as well," Jim said, "and the ambulance. And Ernie Jenkins, he likes fires." But we only called the fire brigade, and soon the fire engine came, and 3 tall men in helmets brought a hose into the house, and Mr. Prothero got out just in time before they turned it on. Nobody could have had a noisier Christmas Eve. And when the firemen turned off the hose and were standing in the wet, smoky room, Jim's aunt, Miss Prothero, came downstairs and peered in at them. Jim and I waited very quietly to hear what she would say to them. She said the right thing, always. She looked at the 3 tall firemen in their shining helmets, standing among the smoke and cinders and dissolving snowballs, and she said, "Would you like anything to read?"
Another really important aspect of Christmas for us is a film made, I'm going to say in the late 1940s or in the early 1950s. It's called A Wonderful Life, starring, of course, James Stewart and others. And rather like A Christmas Carol, it's a story about a man. Unlike Ebenezer Scrooge, the kind of protagonist in this film isn't a kind of miser, far from it. He's the opposite of Scrooge. He's generous. And far from being lonely and isolated, George Bailey is a man who is just full of relationships and love. But like Scrooge, something needs to shift in his life, because his problem is he wants to move. He's always wanted to move. He's always wanted to leave Bedford Falls, where this film takes place, and he's wanted a better life, a more adventurous life, a more affluent life, and he's fantasized throughout his life about moving on. And of course that never happens. And the film is a long film. It's well over 2 hours long. It's well worth watching if you haven't seen it. I'm not going to give the plot away to you. But there comes a moment, a big moment in this film, where George Bailey wants to take his life. And he decides to do that. But there's a kind of a fascinating backstory to this film, because the film begins in heaven. It begins with an angel called Clarence being summoned to come to earth to save Mr. Bailey. Because Mr. Bailey wants to take his life, but what he hasn't realized, this guy, is that without him, without his life, everybody else's life would have been impoverished and probably ruined, and this entire town wouldn't have been the same without him. And so Clarence, this rather eccentric and not too bright angel, is sent down to rescue George Bailey. And at the very end of the film, and this is the clip I'm going to show you, everybody comes. He's faced ruin. The reason Bailey has decided to take his life is he's faced financial ruin. Something has happened in the building and loan company that he inherited from his own dad. Something has happened which has brought him to ruin, the company to ruin, likely imprisonment. Well, he doesn't take his life. He comes home and is immediately faced with an entire community that comes to show their generosity, to literally bail him and his family out. And it's the most moving part of the film. And there are lots of moving parts in it. So let's enjoy It's a Wonderful Life and the final scene.
Mary! 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 Well, hello, Mr. Bank Examiner. How?
Mr. Bailey, there's a deficit.
I know, $8,000.
George, I've got a little paper.
I'll bet it's a warrant for my arrest. Isn't it wonderful? I'm going to jail. Merry Christmas. Reporters. Where's Mary? Mary! Oh, look at this wonderful old drafty house. Mary! 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 Have you seen my wife?
Mary, Daddy.
Kids! Hey! Oh. Kids! Janie told me. Look at you. Oh, I could eat you up. Where's your mother?
She went looking for you. With Uncle Billy. Daddy!
Suzu, my little ginger snap. How do you feel?
Fine. Not a smidge of temperature.
Not a smidge of... Hallelujah.
Hello. George, darling. Mary. George, darling. Where are you? Oh, George. George.
Let me touch you. Are you real?
George.
Well, you have no idea what's happened to me.
I have no idea what happened. Well, come on, George. Come on downstairs. Quick, they're on their way.
All right.
Come on. Come on in here now. Now you stand right over here by the tree. Right there. And don't move. Don't move. What's happening? Oh, I hear them coming now. George, it's a miracle. It's a miracle. What's happening? Who's gonna come, Daddy? Daddy? Come in, Uncle Billy. Everybody in here.
George!
Isn't it wonderful? So many friends. Mary did it, George. Mary did it. She told some people you were in trouble with it. They scattered all over town collecting money. Didn't ask any questions. Just said, George in trouble. And tell me, idiot.
What is this?
Like it spread like fair.
Another run on stage? Here, George. Merry Christmas.
There we are. The line farms on the right. Now, come in, George. Now, Merry Christmas. And God bless you. Oh, Mr. Martini. Martini. Step right up there. I busted the jukebox, too.
Major Ransom
some beer to play with.
I wouldn't have a roof over my head if it wasn't for you, George.
Just a minute. Quiet, everybody. Quiet. Now get this. It's from London.
Oh.
Mr. Gower cabled you need cash. Stop. My office instructed to advance you up to $25,000. Stop.
Oh.
Hee-haw and Merry Christmas, Sam Wainwright.
How about some wine?
The fool flew all the way up here in a blizzard.
Harry, how about your banquet in New York?
Oh, I left right in the middle of it. As soon as I got Mary's telegram. Good idea, Ernie. A toast. To my big brother, George, the richest man in town. Christmas present from a very dear friend of mine.
Look, Daddy, teacher says every time a bell rings, an angel gets his wings.
That's right. That's right. Attaboy, Clarence.
Growing up in Llanelli, for that's where we moved after, so I've already mentioned that I was born in Griffithstown, and we then left Risca, Monmouthshire, as it was then called, to go west, back to my father's roots, west of Llanelli, west of Swansea, to a town called Llanelli, and that's where we were. And emotionally, that's always felt like home to me. We were only there for about 7 years as a family, but when people ask me, well, where do you come from? Well, we lived in a number of places because we moved around a fair bit, but Llanelli has always felt like home, always. And Llanelli, unlike Monmouthshire, was at that point, at any rate, things have changed, but it was a cradle of the Welsh language, and so the carol that we had earlier, O Dewch Fodloniaid, would have been sung regularly, not just in Sion Llanelli, but in so many other churches and chapels across that area. But my mother was musical. Mair, she taught the piano, and she wanted all of us as children to be musical in one way or another. Many of my siblings played the piano or the guitar. And at this point in my life, I was about, 7, let's say, when this particular story happened. I didn't play anything. I had no appetite for the piano. I think I didn't particularly want to be taught by my mother because I knew she'd be quite strict. And I was lazy, and I thought, this is not going to work. I had no great liking for the guitar, and so I didn't take that up. But my mother wanted us to do something special as a family. And so one Christmas, she got us together and said, we're going to sing a carol as a family. And that's what we did. I think it was the year that Sound of Music came out, and we saw that as a family as well, actually. And that's another interesting memory for me. It's a bit of a slight detour from this particular story. It was the summer of 1966, and as a family, we went to Butlins in Skegness for our summer holiday. Bearing in mind we were living in Llanelli, and there were no motorways in those days. I can't tell you how long it took us to get from West Wales to the east of England, but we did it. It probably took all day. And we were, all 7 of us, jammed, I think, into a Hillman Minx. It was not a big car. No seat belts in sight. I mean, there were 4 of us, and there were bench seats. And so I have memories of sitting in the front seat with my dad driving the car, my brother Ewan next to me, and then me sitting on my mother's lap. And we drove with the other kids in the back. But we went up there to Butlins in Skegness. And Billy Butlin had, as a kind of another slight detour, had been brought up in quite a dysfunctional home, but had very fond memories of church as a child. And he had made it a point when he became very famous and very wealthy, that as a kind of thank you to the church, because he'd had a lot of unhappiness in his life, but church, thankfully for him, had happy memories. And so he made it possible for every minister or priest or vicar in Britain could have a free holiday once a year. And we did that. We did it for this one year. Now, I had a great time. It has to be said, nobody else did in my family. They had a very miserable time. It rained all week. And I don't think Butlins is really my parents' cup of tea or anybody else's, but it was mine. I had a fantastic time. And one of the things we did, we saw films because they were free, I seem to think. But we certainly saw A Sound of Music. And of course, that's the story of the Von Trapp family. So coming back quite possibly to the Christmas of 1966, my mother had an idea. Let's be like the Von Trapp family, and let's do a Christmas carol. As I've already said, all my other siblings played something, guitars, pianos. They sang well I could sing. So my mother said, well, what are we going to give Gethin to play? And she came up with this brainwave. Let's give him a kazoo. And that's what we did. We rehearsed a carol and we performed it in Sion Llanelli one Christmas, the Christmas of 1966. And the pulpits in Welsh chapels in those days were not small affairs. I mean, the one in Sion Llanelli was capacious. It was enormous. I mean, it was more like a veranda. It was more like a kind of the large decking of a garden with a kind of rail around it. I mean, that's how enormous Sion Llanelli. I mean, it was a big church, Sion Llanelli. I mean, it took seated well over 1,000 people. I think 1,500 people could be seated, if not more, into that chapel. The building's still there, but it's now become now is run as a library, I think, or a community centre by the council there. But there we were, the Russell Joneses, Llanelli's version of the Von Trapp family, and we sang Joy to the World with me memorably playing the kazoo. Sadly, thankfully, there's no video film recording of that rendition of Joy to the World, but we're going to finish this Sound of My Christmas, or My Sound of Christmas, with that wonderful Charles Wesley carol. Joy to the World.
Perfect. Okay, so go.
sharing a few Christmas thoughts and ramblings with me. I hope you're going to have a great Christmas. It's going to be a very different Christmas this year, isn't it, for all of us? The plans that we made, even possibly just a few days ago, have had to change dramatically. But we know, however reluctantly we might admit to it, we know that it's all for the best. And we're going to keep a lot of people a lot safer by having smaller Christmases and being limited to a smaller group of people. Maybe next year we'll have much more extravagant Christmases. People have already said that Easter will be the new Christmas next year. Well, let's hope it can be. And let's hope the next Christmas will be bigger and better, and we'll be all together in our various churches, Ararat or wherever it is you happen to worship. But from me and from Claire and from all of us here at Ararat, from all the staff and the deacons, from all the members, to all of you, from all of us, Happy Christmas and a Merry New Year. Nadolig llawen, a blwyddyn newydd dda.